Constitution didn't simply abolish slavery. It abolished slavery with an exception, and the exception is still open. Think about 1865 for a second. After the Civil War, Section 1 of the 13th Amendment finally settled the legal status of slavery, and it did it in a single sentence. In her book, Are Prisons Obsolete?, Angela Davis renders the amendment's exception this way, and it rewards reading slowly. Davis wrote, quote, "Slavery and involuntary servitude were abolished, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted." End quote. Read it twice. Most of us read it once and only hear the first half. But the amendment ends slavery and, in the same breath, carves out a place where involuntary servitude can legally continue as a punishment for those a court has convicted. And here's why that isn't just a footnote about 1865. It changes how you read the one institution we treat as the most natural thing in the world, the obvious answer to crime. The story we inherit is simple. Slavery ended, and the prison quietly took over the ordinary work of justice. That story can feel like enough, right up until you notice the exception is right there in the text, in plain words. And this isn't a museum piece. As recently as 2024, California asked its own voters to remove involuntary servitude as a punishment from the state constitution, and the measure failed. So California's version of the exception stayed in force. So the question the book puts to you isn't whether prisons can be made a little kinder. It's where the prison came from in the first place, and whether a society that built it could decide to outgrow it. Davis walks us through four things: the loophole, the reform that became the cage, the business that runs on it, and a future she says isn't empty at all. Start with what that exception made possible. After emancipation, in state after southern state, legislatures passed the Black Codes, laws that criminalized things like vagrancy, loitering, and lacking proof of employment, enforced almost entirely against Black people, who could then be convicted, and once convicted, legally put to work. Out of that grew the convict lease system, in which southern states leased prisoners, the targets overwhelmingly Black, to private industry, to railways and mines and large plantations. Davis doesn't soften it. Davis wrote, quote, "Black people became the prime targets of a developing convict lease system, referred to by many as a reincarnation of slavery," end quote. And the honest objection almost writes itself. Reincarnation of slavery sounds like a phrase built for effect, a comparison that flatters the argument and skips the evidence. The trouble is the mechanism, which doesn't resolve as easily as you'd want. Under the lease, Davis notes, prisoners could be worked to death without affecting a convict crew's profitability. The historical record backs the horror. Leased people were unpaid and held in lethal conditions. This is also exactly where a careless argument overreaches, and Davis won't let you go there without her. She draws the line herself. She is explicit that she was not suggesting abolition had produced an era of equality and justice. Her claim is narrower and harder to wave off. A whole structure of forced, racially targeted labor, Davis argues, was rebuilt inside that one exception in the law. The lease system itself is long behind us, but the clause that helped enable it is still on the books. Okay, so the obvious response to a brutal prison is to reform it. Make it more humane. Who could argue with that? And here's Davis's most counterintuitive move. She argues that reform is exactly how the prison digs in. And the history is on her side. Because the penitentiary, the prison as we know it, arrived as a reform. Davis wrote, quote, "The prison itself was a product of concerted efforts by reformers to create a better system of punishment," end quote. The cell and the measured sentence arrived, in the reformer's own eyes, as the enlightened alternative to punishment done on the body in public. Now follow the line Davis draws from that reform to the present, and it ends at the Supermax, where isolation can run past 15 consecutive days, which the United Nations Nelson Mandela rules class as prolonged solitary confinement, and which its expert on torture, Juan Mendez, has called a form of psychological torture. The humane fix, on her account, hardened into the cruelest cage we've built. And I want to be careful, because Davis is careful. She is not saying every reform is a betrayal. Her target is the framework that relies, in her word, exclusively on reform, the habit of only ever asking how to improve the prison and never whether to keep it. A change that eases suffering inside the walls is worth fighting for. A change that makes the walls feel permanent, that lets a society decide it's done enough, that's the trap. And notice where that leaves us, because Davis leaves us there on purpose. If reform becomes the only horizon we ever look at, and abolition sounds impossible, we are genuinely stuck. Don't let me resolve that too fast. The test her argument suggests is easy to say and hard to use. Does a given fix shrink the prison's footprint, or does it quietly deepen it? That tension does not resolve here. We come back to it. Because there's a piece of the puzzle we haven't added yet. If the prison isn't simply tracking crime, then what else is driving it? Davis argues that across the era of the prison boom, incarceration cannot be explained by crime rates alone, and that the two came uncoupled. To explain a system that grows regardless, she says you have to break a habit of thought. Davis wrote, quote, "Punishment has to be conceptually severed from its seemingly indissoluble link with crime," end quote. Make that cut, and other forces come into view. Davis names two, working together: profit and racism. She calls the machinery around it the prison industrial complex, a web of companies that build, supply, and staff the apparatus of incarceration, wrapped inside a media culture that runs on fear. Look at one correlation Davis cites from the Center for Media and Public Affairs. Across that decade, the country's murder rate was falling fast, cut by roughly half. And yet, murder coverage on the big national networks climbed to several times what it had been. The fear went up while the danger went down. When she wrote the book, she named a company then called the Corrections Corporation of America, today CoreCivic. And in the years since, the private detention business has only grown. In 2025, its two largest firms, Geo Group and CoreCivic, reported record revenues in the billions, with a boom in federal immigration detention a major driver. That is a civil system, technically separate from criminal prisons, yet run by the very same companies on much the same logic. Now, the strongest pushback here is fair, and you should raise it. Private prisons are only a small share of the whole system. So how can profit be the driver? And Davis meets it head on. She concedes private prisons are only the most visible part of the complex. Abolish them tomorrow, she says, and it stays, in her word, relatively intact, because the public prisons are wired into that same corporate economy just as deeply. And that concession cuts both ways. It rescues her argument and complicates it at once. If even the public prisons are tied to that same economy, the incentive is far harder to point at and far harder to dismantle than a single greedy company would be. The problem is bigger than the scapegoat. Her argument was never one greedy company. It's that the prison's permanence, on her account, is produced out of profit and racism and fear. And something produced is not the same thing as something necessary. So, on Davis's telling, the prison shape was set by a legal exception, deepened by reform, and held in place by money and habit. And we still have that unfinished dilemma from the reform section. If fixing it entrenches it, and we can't picture the alternative, we're stuck. That stuckness is the whole reason people call abolition naive. Here's the comfortable place to land. Abolition sounds noble, but it can never actually tell you what goes in the space where the prison stands. Watch what Davis does with that. She doesn't fill the space. She says the demand for a single replacement is the mistake. Davis wrote, quote, "The first step, then, would be to let go of the desire to discover one single alternative system of punishment that would occupy the same footprint as the prison system." End quote. There's no one thing that drops into that hole. In her telling, abolition isn't an emptiness, it's a presence, a whole constellation of institutions and practices that slowly make the prison less necessary. Schools funded well enough that they stop being what Davis calls prep schools for prison. Healthcare, mental and physical, a person can actually reach. Decriminalizing conduct that was never dangerous. And justice built around repair instead of retribution. And if you're skeptical, and you should stay skeptical, some of these have been tested in narrow, specific ways. One San Francisco study found that young people accused of felonies who went through restorative justice diversion were about 44% less likely to be rearrested within 6 months than those sent through the courts. And the report that gathered that result argues restorative justice belongs with serious cases too, not only the minor ones. And the Bureau of Prisons' own review of the screen group released to home confinement under the CARES Act found their 1-year recidivism came in modestly lower than a matched comparison, while cautioning the result does not generalize to everyone in prison. But be honest about the shape of that evidence. It suggests the prison's footprint can shrink without safety collapsing. It does not yet show a complete answer for the moment when someone is genuinely dangerous and repair is refused. That gap is the one the ending has to face. None of that is a finished proof, but the pieces of the alternative already exist, scattered and underfunded and real. So, are prisons obsolete? I keep going back to where we started, that one sentence, and the exception hiding in the second half of it. Here is what Davis has actually earned, and it is worth saying precisely. She has shown that the prison is a human invention, not a law of nature, shaped by an exception, deepened by reform, and sustained by a market. That case for non-inevitability is strong. What she has not shown, and this is the honest limit, is a fully worked replacement for every case. She names the hardest question right out loud. Davis wrote, quote, "What will happen to the murderers and rapists?" End quote. That's the question that drains the confidence out of the argument. And here is the honest read. For a great deal of what fills prisons, the constellation is plausible. But for the people who commit serious violence, Davis offers less a system than a direction, illustrated by a single story she recounts, the reconciliation of Amy Bill's family with those responsible for her death. It's genuinely moving, and it is one story. And an argument that wants to replace the prison for the hardest cases has to show more than that. It has to show how a society prevents serious harm, repairs it, holds people accountable, and, where someone truly is dangerous, keeps others safe, all without simply rebuilding the cage under a softer name. Davis leaves it unfinished, and so should we. Not because the book fails, but because this is exactly where honest thinking has to begin, with the prison proven contingent rather than eternal, and the hardest question still genuinely open. What was built can be unbuilt. What to build in its place? For the people we most fear is the question Davis cannot fully answer, and neither, yet, can we. That is not a failure of the book. It is the size of the problem it makes you see.